Hello, people of the internet, this is a Geek Gaming Culture channel. During Jim's latest quizzition, they had mentioned a YouTuber, Dunkey, who had started up a game publishing label by the name of Bigmode. This is surprisingly the first time I've ever heard of either the YouTuber or the label, that being Dunkey and that being Bigmode. And I wanted to find out more before I came out with this, but apparently the reviewer's intentions, while might be just, does raise some ire. He claimed that the label would weed out the rubbish and only bring us the quote-unquote good games, hyping himself and his company up in the process. This can be subjective though, as one developer pointed out. There's a harsh reality when you get into some things, like how many people worked on a game and have the passion that their higher ups might not, or what is one's trash is another's treasure. Who gets to make the final call? Whose taste in games are we going to go on in order to be the judge on who gets the nod and who gets snubbed? Also, though some may appreciate the anti-NFT and blockchain mindset of Dunkey, remember in one of my previous videos why some might not be taking that position in good faith, as those also have the property of not being within the realm of government regulation, meaning they can bypass many sanctions set against countries and people. See the Freedom Convoy and a certain conflict in the world for why that might be significant. Not so much about security as it is people wanting to smear companies that won't do self-restriction to appease someone else's fringe political viewpoints that ignore any subtext or nuances. And that's not even beginning to get into the idea that somebody with this type of company might not be objective in reviewing games anymore when their channel is dedicated to being objective about the games they cover. Still though, it remains to be seen if something on the scale of something like Bigmode will have what it needs to succeed. And even the most hardened person is still, for the most part, hoping that success comes Dunkey's way. There's just a lot more questions than answers someone has right now. But that doesn't stop Jim, Stephanie. How many names does this person have at this point? From making it about them and to completely gaslight and exaggerate the amount of outlandish complaints that someone has received. Just listen to what Jim mentions about the complaints that Dunkey's received.
It's Dunkey and his partner Leah who have put their skin in this game, and so they unveiled Bigmode to a crowd that brimmed with a mixture of support, excitement, skepticism, implausible anger, and no small amount of smugness from a vocal group who seem eager to see the whole thing fail.
This is weird, considering that none of the complaints that were mentioned ever really came up by some of the more prominent people in the industry, but simple people that would not be given the time of day if Jim didn't mention anything about them. First, this shows how often Jim wants to punch down all the time instead of punching up, trying to find a single person that said something so negative that would make even the most hardened person cringe, and then amplify it in a way that makes people think that the majority of those showing concern about something had that reason behind it. Why does Jim keep doing this? I can understand if it was someone that has the pull in the game industry, or someone who people were actually listening to, someone that had a fan base that would be able to give Jim a worthy debate, or would be able to defend themselves, or would be able to counter them when they had made those claims. For the record, no one was defending Activision or Ubisoft, and I'll get to that in a moment since Jim mentions them in the video. But when it comes to talking about who gave the thing or people that Jim is trying to defend a hard time, it's never those that have a Twitter checkmark, as much as we never know anymore who actually qualifies for those. But it's always some nobody on social media, and if Jim can't find it, they simply make it up like they seemingly did last week with the GTA 6 quote that Jim has yet to answer about if it exists or not. Don't worry, I'll get to why I say that way in a moment too. But this is one of the many reasons Jim has lost some of the cred they once had. They can't just continue to punch down. It shows that their takes can't hold up to serious scrutiny. If it takes wild digging and name searching yourself on Twitter to find that one tweet that disparages you the way you want to twist it into, or if you have to seemingly just make up things out of thin air, then you lose the plot and people stop listening to you, which they have with Jim. Those that have had some street cred in gaming have mentioned that they have some concerns about this endeavor that Dunkey has, and though there might be some that are awaiting the failure of Bigmode, assuming they exist because Jim never cites any of them, something else that gets annoying to have to keep demanding people do when they claim something is as widespread as the negativity that Jim said came Dunkey's way, cite your sources. The matter is that those people were never those with a big following. There's a suspicion as to why Jim won't be able to handle such a blowback to their already damaged reputation. so they don't want specific people to know that they are talking about that person. If Jim were to name drop the Quartering of Melody Mac or Cloudfish or Asmongold or anyone else like that, you know they have enough of a following that knows what someone actually said that and can show clear evidence to the contrary. Of course, that won't stop Jim's rabid fanbase from continuing to worship them like Alison Pregler's do with her lackluster content and attitude. We still don't get to see anyone bothering to ask for the receipt of those claims. Not even one critic of their work anywhere. Again, unfortunately for Jim and for Allison, I exist. And I have a feeling Jim is watching my content because they did cite one particular tweet that was criticizing them. The blurring of the name, I found it by the way, so yes, this does exist, is there. But also the screen capping in the tweet is a plus here, and it's something that I have said before that Jim should be doing instead of just us taking their word for it. This tweet is about something that I'll segue into in a moment. Jim puts up a trigger warning for transphobia in the tweet, but in said tweet, the only reference of this, and the only thing that Jim could have cited, is something of a wash. Tweeter mentions a midlife crisis, as if they feel that Jim is bullying an Ezra Miller about the entire thing. Other than that, the tweet get people back on track instead of being distracted by what Jim is trying to get you to focus on in the tweet. Is saying that they would have rather see someone with more experience than someone like Jim, who has not shown to have good faith in their takes or little effort in their videos that are being made. Your mileage may vary, but I feel that Jim's focus on the off-color remark at the beginning loses the focus of what Jim should be answering about, which is something that the user is only parroting from a bevy of others. Probably drives Jim nuts that those that do punch up and can counter their narrative can't be dismissed because of being careful of making their cases about what Jim says instead of off-color personal attacks, only bringing up their identity if they do. Oh, and notice that Jim never quote tweeted this one, since we all know that some people would agree with that second half of the tweet, even if they did cringe at those first few lines. However, the tweet in question is about the one thing that becomes the more troubling aspect of this episode. Last week, Jim announced that they would be writing lore for an indie game called Vampire Survivors, an early access game. Dunkey published early access games because I do know of a few that would qualify as good early access games, but I digress. It seems like a game from a developmental studio named Ponsel. I can't get much info about this developer, but the game seems like a bullet hell game without much plot. Though, who needs it when your game is a pixelated version of Nature Red, which is a good game mind you. But apparently they do, since Jim is now tasked with writing lore for the game. Though Jim said they got some positive feedback, probably from their worshipping fanbase, they claimed that some of the feedback was spicy. Well, they used some of the many F-bombs that YouTube will let them do, but no one else will be allowed to do without demonetizing their videos. Or at least there's no indication that Jim's videos are getting the shaft from YouTube, making us believe a double standard exists before the word spicy. And yet, the tweet that Jim showed, the only tweet that they had to show you that such comments exist. And the person didn't even tag Jim. Yes, I looked, and they didn't even at them. Jim had to name search to find this one. Shows you how much they went looking for trouble. But this shows the very same thing that Dunkey is going to run into with Bigmode. How can Jim be objective in the review or any review or discussion about this game? This is what people who you'd have to punch up to hit were actually saying here. That it's much harder to be involved in the process than it is to just be on the outside looking in. There's much more of a squeamish feeling of how Jim segued into discussing this. Jim somehow, for some reason or another, found a roadmap to connect Dunkey's endeavor into Jim's own. It felt like the only reason Jim even thought of discussing Dunkey's company or to even bring up the subject was to try to shoehorn things into making a video about being hired themselves. Like this was about Jim and not Dunkey. Is Jim trying to campaign for Bigmode to publish Vampire Survivors? Because this is the only reason why I suspect that Jim connected one thing with another. After all, Jim cited one tweet that they had to name search, Jim Sterling by the way, not Stephanie Sterling, which they still use the name Jim, thus saying they still accept people calling Jim, well, Jim, thus not transphobic to use the name to identify themselves. But when it came to negativity about Bigmode, you'll have to do your own research to find those tweets. Imagine that, having to do your own research. You're allowed to do it with that, but not about certain health scares. But I digress. After all, Jim mentions the former CEO of Ubisoft and Bobby Kotick. The former is the former head, tells you a lot about that, and the latter just about every gamer cried foul about when they heard about that news, yet Jim still won't give him credit because you heard the reasons why. But remember who else Jim is aligned with. Someone who has repeatedly went about hiding continued acts of nepotism in order to get favorable coverage for her games. The same person who was accused falsifying reports against another game developer who was so devastated by not being able to defend themselves against the allegations that they ended themselves. Not saying she caused it, her actions certainly did not help. The same person who has been reported to be very difficult to work with and has threatened several journalists in the past to never report on her negatively, sometimes holding their careers on the line about it, all without shame and remorse, and all without thinking she's doing anything wrong about it. She has yet to apologize for any of this, and her rabid fanbase still defends her to this day. And this is the same Jim Sterling that has yet to call out the video game media landscape, which is something that Dunkey seemingly didn't do in his announcement of Bigmode. The video game media is just as much, if not more, at fault for the landscape being what it is. How many more times do we have to tell the media that you can't just slap on an 8, 10 out of 10 on the latest Madden installment, a game and company that you think Jim would bring up given their continued hatred toward AAAs, that slaps Madden's prestigious name on something and thinks that's enough for us to buy it when it's abhorrent every year? Or recognize that you don't have to continue to tell us your personal opinions on the world at large in a review that has nothing to do about said opinion, and then use that opinion to judge if a game is good or not, as we saw in the Destroy All Humans remastered reviews. Yes, we have opinions, and don't mind games delivering a political or moral message, as long as it's not pandering, being preachy, and has a point in the story that the game is trying to convey, far from what Jim thinks we're talking about with politics and games. This is why there was some uneasiness when we heard about this thing about Jim being a writer for this game. All this notwithstanding about what type of lore they will add and how their own politics play a role if they will shoehorn things into the game that have no place in that specific game, that is more about mindless shooting than some meaningful message. There's every suspicion that Jim will not be partial or objective when talking about this game. We need to know that Jim will constantly disclose that they are on the developmental team of this game when it's brought up in subsequent videos. YouTube makes us do it, and then government bodies won't apply that same aspect to print media for some reason. If they don't ding Jim if and when they talk about the game in any future video without revealing that they are on the team, then we will know what is really going on. Now look, I don't know if Dunkey's endeavor will pan out or not. I have more questions than answers, as I said, though I don't hope for failure. Competition is always good for any market. He will need to figure out many things, and he will before long. I can't tell him how to handle it, and hopefully this is a lane that he can keep up the pace with the rest of the traffic in said lane. That's where the phrase, stay in your lane, is coming from. Don't get in that lane if you're not prepared to handle yourself in the traffic that's already in that lane. Even with that, it's highly disingenuous of Jim to use this as a way to peddle and shill for their own endeavors, and to gaslight and exaggerate things to, once more, boost their own ego. All before punching down, as always, and never attack anyone who is in a position to defend themselves and actually challenge Jim. Not expecting Rufus to do anything of the sort anytime soon though. No trigger warning needed, I'm afraid, but maybe an alarm clock, because Jim continues to be woke but never awake. This is a Geek Gaming Culture channel that just happened.